Is it all right if I
I guess
record?
that's you. Okay, let's see here. All right, thank you. All right. Um, let's see, can everybody see that okay? I'll play from start. We good?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna, as I said, talk about racial classification in the census. And I just wanted to just start out briefly. Al Sadiq passed around a chapter out of racial formation. If you haven't read it, that's fine. It's probably much more than you need to sort of cover for this talk. But I just wanted to say a few things about the sort of conceptual framework and that I employ. And that essentially racial formation is the historical social process, socio-historical process of race making. It's how race is made, not as being given, and its impact throughout the social order. And since we're talking in the mode of othering and belonging, race making can be seen as a process of othering, of defining and categorizing people as other. Now, defining people as other is obviously not restricted to distinctions based on race, and that gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, and even age. I think about that as being a senior, among other perceived differences, are frequently evoked to justify structures of inequality, of differential treatment, subordinate status, and in some cases, of violent conflict and war. And as I think maybe John Powell may have covered, as social beings, we use forms of racial classification, forms of othering to actually navigate in the world, to quickly discern, for example, who might be friend or foe, and to provide clues that guide us in our social interactions with the individuals and the groups we encounter. And some of this also is related to the unconscious mind and implicit bias, which I'm sure many of you know about, and we could be, and we'll be drawn into this conversation as well. The point I want to make out of this brief take on racial formation is that the very act of defining racial groups is really a process that's fraught with a lot of confusion, contradiction, and unintended consequences. Government definitions of race and racial categories have varied enormously over time and place. And even in 19th and early 20th century America, for example, it was possible for an individual to simply change one's race simply by crossing state lines. That different states had different notions of who was white, who was black, who was other racial categories as well. And so it's very important to see that these things are not very consistent, but there's something that is very much shaped by a process of, as I said, confusion, contradiction, and unintended consequences. So let me briefly cover why the census is important. Many of you know this already. One thing is, of course, that the Constitution requires us to engage in an actual enumeration every 10 years. And every 10 years, there's always a debate or contentious debate about some aspect of the census. We recall this in this last period, it was about whether or not we were going to ask a citizenship question and the impacts that that may have in people's responses to filling out the census. In many respects, the census is a form of national accounting that provides a kind of collective portrait of who we are as a people. Then we get into some of the issues which are extremely important in terms of the polity and the economy, which is that political reapportionment is a zero-sum game, such that the House of Representatives was capped at 435 members after the 1910 census. And it therefore limits the size of the House, and it transforms reapportionment into this very competitive, as it says here, zero-sum game. That some states win, some cases, some states lose. as a result of the census. Let's see, since 1850, for example, California has averaged about 3.4 new House seats after each census. And so undercounts, that's why people are so drawn to some of these kinds of hot button issues, really determines much about the sort of political apportionment within the House of Representatives. But not only that, well over half of the federal spending or allocations is allocated on based on census population counts as well. That includes Medicare, highway planning and construction, education grants, programs like Head Start. And thus, the greater the state's undercount, the more federal dollars the state has to lose. Now, with that, and I'll stop on occasion. If people have any questions, please chime in and just interrupt me, as the case may be. I want to talk about my initial interest in state definitions about race. And it was really inspired by this case in the United States, in Louisiana, actually, in the 1980s. And it was about the Susie Gilby Phipps case. Now, in 1977, it goes back to 1977, this woman, Susie Gilby Phipps, was then 43 years old, and she found herself in need of a birth certificate in order to process a passport application. Her husband was going to take her out of the country for the first time. She had never been abroad. And she can't find her birth certificate. So she goes down to the Louisiana, New Orleans division, rather, of Vital Records to have a revised or a new birth certificate. So imagine her surprise when the clerk at the New Orleans Bureau of Division of Vital Records shows that on her new birth certificate, oh, I should say this, Susie Gilby Phipps, for all her 43 years at this point, believed herself to be a white woman, that her revised birth certificate is going to say that she is Black. A couple of quotes from Ms. Phipps that I like. One is, "It shocked me. I was sick for 3 days. I was brought up white. I married white twice." And what was interesting about this case was that Ms. Phipps fell under a 1970 Louisiana state law that allowed for anybody who had more than 1/32 Black blood to be legally defined as Black in the state of Louisiana. All right? Now look at that. We're not talking 1770 or 1870. This is 1970. And it's even more curious. I won't go into it. We could talk about this later if you're more interested in this. But it was part of a civil rights package because prior to this, whoever assisted in the delivery of a birth of a baby, a doctor, a midwife, whoever, was supposed to fill out the race box on the baby's birth certificate. And folks, legislators said that's fraught with, that's too subjective. We need a much more clear, scientific method of establishing racial identity. And so it was this more than 1/32 Black blood. The state did a genealogical investigation of Ms. Phipps and found that she was in fact 3/32 Black. It goes back to a great, I don't know how many greats I have to add, grandmother who was a Black woman slave named Margarita. Okay. So in fact, this shows you the ways in which states themselves can define racial categories and in turn establish racial identities. Go on this. Now, the designation of racial categories and the determination of racial identity is no simple task. And over the last several centuries, it's provoked numerous debates in this country, among others, intense debates about natural legal rights, over who could become a citizen, and over who could marry whom. I mean, it's worth remembering, as you all know that, or might know, that was until 1952 that race could no longer be used to deny a person the right to naturalization, to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. And of course, it wasn't until 1967 with the Loving decision that the Supreme Court invalidated laws prohibiting interracial marriage. And so the racial and ethnic categories in the United States have historically been shaped by the political and social agendas of particular times. And I'm going to show you this, and this is kind of I won't go into this too deeply. I got this off of sociologist Ren Farley at the University of Michigan. And it's the racial terms that have been used in the census from 1900 to, over the 20th century, 1900 to 1990. And you'll see that for the most part, and this is true even to Census 2020, there's actually been almost no two censuses that had consistent racial and ethnic categories or asking the same kinds of questions. You'll see, for example, or you may actually, there's only been, throughout the 20th century, only 3 racial labels, categories that have been consistent. And those 3 categories are Chinese, Japanese, and white. With Japanese and Chinese being seen as 2 different racial categories. But also the term Black has not been consistent. There's times it's been Negro, Negro, Black. It's Negro between 1920 and 1960. You'll see all these kinds of changes in labeling over time. I just want to point out a few interesting ones. The term Mexican was only used as a racial term once in 1930. And then, because it was objected to by Mexican Americans here, as well as the Mexican government, it was later taken off. And that's got a longer tricky history, where Mexicans were to be coded as white. This was particularly true after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, after the end of the Mexican-American War, which the US initiated, that Mexicans who resided in the territories that now became the United States could, in fact, after 1 year, become citizens of the United States. The question of whiteness is another matter entirely. You'll see too here in 1910 and 1920, there was a mulatto category. The other one, which is really strange, is in 1930 and 1940, there was a Hindu category. Hindu is actually a religious category. It was meant to capture the number of Asian Indians or South Asians in the United States, who for the most part were Sikh. Secondly, Muslim, and probably third, Hindu. But nonetheless, Hindu became utilized as a kind of racialized label. And then you'll see after the 1970s in particular, there's a proliferation of categories. Many of them are actually Asian and Pacific Islander categories. So there's been these kinds of broad changes over historical time. All right. Anybody have questions? Let me know. Let me move on. Many of you are familiar with these categories. This is what's known as the OMB Directive 15 categories. I'm showing you the ones here that are still in use, that were a revision in 1997 of categories that were established in 1977. And what happened in 1977 is that different federal agencies came together in order to establish standard categories and definitions for the federal government agencies to use. Veterans Affairs, different organizations, different agencies, bureaus within the United States government were using different kinds of categories for the recording purposes. And the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which resides in the White House, said we needed to establish some consistent and standardized categories which we could use. So these are the categories and definitions. And you'll see they all have some notion of original peoples inhabiting a particular geographic area, which is subject to a lot of anthropological debate to begin with. The only explicit racial label is actually Black, which is defined as a person who has any of their origins in the Black racial groups of Africa, all right? And I'm hoping you see that or question what are the Black racial groups of Africa. But there's a lack of parallel structure here. Notice that white is defined as a person in their origins of the original peoples of Europe, Middle East, or North Africa. And why it isn't a person having their origins in the white racial groups of Europe, Middle East, or North Africa is quite another matter. There's a whole lack of parallel structure here. Also note that the indigenous category, American Indian and Alaska Native, says a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, who maintains tribal affiliations or community attachment. And it doesn't require any of the other groups, for example, to maintain some notion of community attachment. That is, in fact, only with this category. And in 1977, it only said the original peoples of North America. And it's the 1997 revisions that included the rest of the Americas in terms of one's indigenous background. Okay. Now, what I want to say about this is that initially established to create standardized categories across federal agencies, it actually had a much more dramatic impact on society as a whole, and that these became, if you will, the basic food groups of American multiculturalism. And these terms get adopted by educational institutions, by the corporate sector, everything, such that they become some of the kinds of, they inordinately influenced how we think about race and ethnicity in the United States. Also note, also note this, that the term Hispanic or Latinx is seen as an ethnic category, not a racial one. And it's the only one the feds are interested in, that you are either Hispanic or non-Hispanic. And you'll see that in all the kinds of government tabulations as well. Okay. Let's see. There's different ways in which I could talk about some of the kinds of well, let me go to the census itself first. These are the questions on the last census on ethnicity and race. And as you see, there's two questions. One is one of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, with three subgroups: Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban. And then it's a person's race. And here we have white, black, and then we have Asian categories on the left, Pacific Islander categories on the right. And people could also have some write-ins as well. This creates some confusion in this part, that if you, it was estimated in the let's see, this begins in 1980, probably 1980, 1990, probably in the last three or four censuses, that people who are Latinx have a difficult time filling this out, because they're supposed to check off an ethnicity category in question 8 and a race category in 9. Say you're an extreme, you're sort of a really white Argentinian, as there are a lot of people of European descent in Argentina. You say that, yes, you're Argentinian, and then on race you say you're white. Or say you're dark-skinned Puerto Rican. You would say that you're Puerto Rican, and you come down to 9 and say you're black. Now that's how the census would like you to fill out, but it's argued that over 40% of people who are Latinx didn't fill out the census correctly. Many of them dropped down to under 9, some of the race, and printed something. And usually it was a Latinx category that they put down there. So something like 96, 97% of people who checked off some of the race were in fact Latinx folks. Let me ask you, any questions or anybody? Well, are there some folks that you would personally have difficulty filling out this census the way the categories are set up?
I always struggle with that. I'm from Chile, and we don't even have a question on race in the census. So we will add one for the first time since the beginning of the of the last century.
Uh-huh.
In the coming census in 2022, is going to be the first time that we are going to add a question about race. We had question about ethnicity and native Chilean people, but not about race. So I wouldn't know what to answer in question 9.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone else have any difficulties with this? Did it? Okay. I'll show you some of the newer census ones, including 2020, and we could talk about what's been different about 2020. Let's see though. I'm gonna do one thing here. I wanted to show you this. I'm sorry, I'm a little lagging on my slides here. This is one, the Pew Research Center did a study in 2015, and you'll see that 2/3 of Latinx adults say that that being Latinx is part of their ethnic and racial background. You'll see that in the kind of lime green, kind of that's not lime green, but this kind of teal green pie chart here, where 13% don't know and 19% say it's a part only of their ethnic background. So the vast bulk of the population they're trying to capture does see it as both a racial and an ethnic identifier. Let me move on. I just want to just touch on this. I think this is mentioned in the article on racial formation, the chapter from the 2015 version of racial formation about the multiracial category. In the 1890s, for example, the census listed a mulatto, a quadroon, and octoroon categories on the census, which eventually fell out. I showed you how mulatto at the beginning part of the 20th century was still used as a category. And it was, this notion about, the census for the most part has always assumed that people had a singular monoracial identity. And this was even true in the 1960 census, for example, where the instructions given to census enumerators was that for persons of mixed white and non-white races, report race of non-white parent. So what we have here is what anthropologists would call hypodescent, that given a dominant and subordinate group, any intermixture between those groups, that person is assigned to the subordinate category. So we also see this in terms of the one drop rule, in which white was seen as a pure category. Intermixture of white and non-white, particularly black, was coded down to, in fact, the subordinate racial category. Now, what happens here is that beginning in the 1990s, there were formal protests lodged to this single race checkoff policy. This particularly came from parents in school districts who felt that their children in the classroom was sort of being forced to choose race if they were in fact, quote unquote, mixed race or multiracial. This was, so it took momentum. There were a number of protests. There was some in the Bay Area. It was an Albany school district, if you're familiar with the community north of Berkeley, where parents were of mixed race children were really requesting the Albany school district to, in fact, employ allow for a multiracial category, or in some cases multiple checkoffs. But what this congealed into two big organizations. One was called Project RACE. RACE is a great acronym. It stands for Reclassify All Children Equally. And the other was the Association for Multi-Ethnic Americans. And they wanted, on Census 2000, lobbying the federal government to put a multiracial checkoff or box on the census. Now, what's been very interesting was that not at first, I was actually in some hearings in about the mid 1990s to late 1990s. And not at first, I was in hearings in Washington about this to do a mixed race, multiracial box on the census. Not at first, but later on, most major civil rights groups opposed it. And here we're talking about Urban League, NAACP, the National Council of La Raza, which was an umbrella organization for hundreds of Latinx organizations, Asian American groups, did not want that. And they didn't want it for a couple of reasons. One was the fears of a diminishment in numbers. And the other part of it was the fear that civil rights laws and compliance, discrimination lawsuits would be rendered much more complex and problematic if you had this multiracial category. What would it mean to have a multiracial category? And you were suing, say, your boss, who was of one of the categories of which you were, somebody who is in fact, say, mixed race, Black and Asian, suing a boss who was, Asian or something like that. It just would allow for this kind of confusion, which people didn't really like. So we had multiracial groups, many of these multiracial groups arguing for a separate multiracial checkoff. We had most of the civil rights groups of color arguing against it. And what the Office of Management and Budget did, which actually neither group wanted, was to propose, which they did in the late 1990s, a mark more than one racial category. In other words, you could mark more than one boxes when identifying themselves for the census and other government programs. And that became adopted in Census 2000. So that's why we now have one in which individuals are able to check off two or more, if in order to sort of reflect. This plays havoc, by the way, with statistics, because let's go back to the Black Asian one. Say you checked off that you were Black and Asian, you would be assigned to part of the count of the Black population in the United States, and you would be counted in the Asian population in the United States. So in other words, it doesn't add up to 100%. And you'll see in some of the kinds of data, if you do data by race and ethnicity, you'll see that it often says Asians who checked Asian only, as opposed to Asian as well as other racial categories and groups. So that's the thing. It allows. There's ways in which you can see how big a group is by who checked off only that as a response, as well as who checked off that in concert with other racial and ethnic categories. All right. And again, stop me at any time. I'm going to show you this. This was really interesting because it proved that my ability to predict what was going on was totally wrong. So in February of 2017, the Census Bureau released the results of what were called the 2015 National Content Test. The Census Bureau does incredible work. I actually, a few years ago, went to the Census Bureau, and after being kind of suspicious, was pretty amazed by how the folks who do stuff around race and ethnicity read the latest literature about race and ethnicity. And they do all these surveys, and they do focus group interviews, and they do mock-ups, and they work with people to see what categories will work. They're under the gun for a lot of political reasons. But in 2015, they did a huge number of testing in response to changing demographics in the United States, in response to the increase and complexity of immigration flows into the country, taking into account some of the fluidity of racial and ethnic self-identification, as well as there were widespread campaigns and lobbying for changes in the questions and categories. I'll give you an example on census, oops, I'm sorry to do this. On census 2010, Iranians had a big campaign to check, not that you're white, don't check you're white, come down to some of the race and write down that you're Iranian, because we didn't have good, the community did not feel that there was good data on the group, because Iranians who, are seen through the census as being white. All right, so in response to this, this study, rather, in response to these demands for changes and to account for new immigration flows. In 2017, this was what I thought was going to be Census 2020. I was convinced this is what was going to happen, and it didn't. But let me go through what's different about this. For this one, there is no separate race or ethnic category. The Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish ethnic category becomes seen as part of one's race and ethnicity more generally. There's more detail on groups. You'll see before that you could just check white, or you would just check you're Black, but there were no subgroups. Didn't say, are you Italian? Or for Blacks, it didn't say, are you Ethiopian? Are you Somali? It just would say, check you're Black or you're white. There's more detail on Asians in Census 2010. But what's new here also is the addition of a Middle Eastern or North African category. You see that on the right, in which you can check off that you're Syrian, Egyptian, Algerian, as well as write-ins for being Israeli, Iraqi, Tunisian, etc. So for the first time, you had a Middle Eastern category added, and you had the Hispanic ethnicity category being coded into one question on one's race and ethnicity. Right. So that's what I thought we were going to get. And now I'll show you what we got. And if you filled out Census 2020, this is what we have. First of all, it's two separate questions. Again, it asks, first of all, are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? It's got a write-in box that has a few more examples, maybe being Salvadoran or Guatemalan. And then there's the second question about race again. There's no Middle Eastern or North African category. That was taken out. But what was preserved was boxes in which there weren't checkoffs, but whites and Blacks for the first time are able to specify their specific quote unquote ethnicity or nationality. All right. And that's what we have. All right. Questions? How are we doing on time here? Let's see. All right. Let me try to move through some stuff here. I'm going to go through this rapidly because one of the questions which has come up around some of this data is why we collect data by race and ethnicity. If particularly some of it is very fraught with a lot of problems. And I want to say that there's very much a political meaning behind these debates regarding racial and ethnic classification. And part of it comes from a pervasive ideology of color blindness. Color blindness being that people believe, in part, the goals of the civil rights movement have been achieved, that racial discrimination is a thing of the past, a bit difficult to think about in the current moment, and that we are truly a colorblind society. But really, the ideology of colorblindness is the belief that sometimes that the most effective anti-racist gesture, policy, and practice is really we should ignore race. We shouldn't be looking at race. And really, it denies that race informs our perceptions, it shapes our attitudes, conscious and unconscious. It influences our individual and collective and institutional practices. But over the past several decades, there's been a real concerted attempt by particularly the political right to ban the collection of racial demographic information. And government policies that utilize racial categories have increasingly been criticized for promoting color consciousness and really subverting the ideology and practice of color blindness. And one of these was called Proposition 54 back in 2003 in California. This was termed the Racial Privacy Initiative, and it would have added an article to the state constitution that said that the state shall not classify any individual by race, ethnicity, color, or national origin in the operation of public education, public contracting, or public employment. Let me say this too, that a lot of people got misled on this initiative, if only because people thought of this in terms of racial privacy. That information, who I am, is that should be private to me and not subject to the state of California classifying me in any specific ways. In fact, when this was circulated as a petition to be placed on the California ballot, there were many communities of color, people in communities of color that signed on to this too, thinking that this would eliminate racial profiling, somehow that the CHP wouldn't stop you or subject you to abuse, which was not true. The architect for this was a man named Ward Connerly, who many of you may be familiar with. Ward Connerly was the man, the former California regent, who in fact was the big backer of both of anti-affirmative action in the state of California, Proposition 209. And he says in here, he wrote this, it was his argument in the voter pamphlet guide. He said, "Dare we forget the lessons of history? Classification systems were invented to keep certain groups in their place and to deny them full rights." And if you ever see some of his writing, check it out. Particularly even in this voter pamphlet, it's like he goes on about how, the rights of Blacks have been circumscribed by their racial classification. He talks about Asians and immigration exclusion. You go through this and you think, wow, Ward Connerly must have taken a lot of ethnic studies classes, because he's really good at being able to talk about how these classification systems have been used to subordinate groups. Now, his problem, however, is that Ward Connerly fails to distinguish between how this data is used in the pre-civil rights period from the post-civil rights period. And what's important to see that he's quite right, that from prohibitions on naturalization rights to the setting of quotas for the 1924 National Origins Immigration Acts, that a lot of these census categories have been defined and strategically utilized to circumscribe the political, economic, and social rights of groups of color. But that after passage of civil rights laws, many of these same categories in census data was used to discern the patterns of discrimination that were practiced by the government, by businesses, schools, and political institutions against people of color and other disadvantaged or disenfranchised minorities. And so data by race became absolutely critical for the enforcement of every civil rights law passed since the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And thus the civil rights era, in many respects, marked an important shift in the use of racial and ethnic data from a tool to exclude, exploit, oppress specific groups to one that was meant to at least ostensibly, ensure inclusion and equity, to look at the patterns of discrimination that were going on. And I say this is because we cannot simply abolish racial classification. I'm very sensitive to this because earlier on, I was talking about the problems with racial and ethnic categories. Earlier on, I mean, not here, but in other forums. And I found myself, that folks, very conservative or right-wing folks in the audiences I was speaking to would say, yeah, I agree with you. Boy, those categories are all messed up. That's why we got to get rid of them. And so I felt like, oh my gosh, I've been using it to criticize it, but I didn't speak directly to why we still needed it, and that we can't simply abolish racial classification. Because the reality is, without some form of racial record keeping, we are unable to empirically observe institutional patterns of racial inequality with respect to income, wealth, educational opportunity. Who's getting COVID-19? Who's not? Who's unemployed? Who's not? We need racial data. We need racial classification in order to assess some important indicators of well-being and life chances. And empirical studies on racial inequality or disparities continue to illustrate the need for race-based data, right? So I'm sorry, a little slow here on the draw. Without some form of racial record keeping, we really can't empirically observe the patterns of racial inequality. Now, that doesn't mean that we could have very adequate, precise, or scientific racial classifications. These categories do change over time, and it's a policy call. What do we want to know and why? Do we want to know whether some groups have suffered from subprime home mortgages and other groups, others not? Or how are we going to look at this stuff is very important. But it does mean that we do need some form of racial classification, because in a racially stratified society, social concepts of race very much do matter. They continue to matter. They continue to profoundly shape our conditions, the very conditions of our life. I'm just going to end on this quote that I like. I got to know the head of Census 2020, Ken Pruitt, who in fact, for the student who teaches at Columbia, is as a prof in the School of International, whatever it's called, International Affairs or something at Columbia University, Ken Pruitt. Oops, I'm gonna skip that. And Ken Pruitt once sent me an article he wrote about the Proposition 54 debate for California to abolish racial classification. And he said, I'm happy to join Ward Connolly in welcoming a colorblind society, but I don't want to be blindfolded as it arrives. And I thought, that's pretty good quote there. It's very true. We might welcome a colorblind society. We certainly don't have one. And we certainly don't want to be blindfolded in the midst of tremendous racial disparities to being able to record them and to transform them into sort of policy and practice, right? And on that, I'll stop and let's talk. I'll get rid of this. Hold on here. Okay, here we go.
Oops.
Thanks, folks. Let me get rid of this.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in if you've got a question.
I actually wanted to emphasize a point that you had made during your conversation about the proposed changes to the census, particularly in regards to Iranian American classification. And speaking as an Iranian American, it's really fascinating that that over the course of the 20th century, we actually saw a whole array of attempts from Middle Easterners broadly, but especially Iranians and Armenians and even Parsis in India to claim whiteness under the eyes of the state, and that this terrain is contested in really complicated ways because and we see this attempt at attaining whiteness through things like the census as a means of recourse and access to resources. And this was especially the case after 1979. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the sort of like complexities of this terrain and the complicated ways in which people have laid claim to these identities, both as means of justice and as a way to distance themselves from other racialized groups.
Yeah, it is a pretty it's a very tragic and complex history. I mean, in many respects, it's kind of in a kind of white supremacist society. It's very common to see groups attempting to sort of, in fact, claim whiteness in some ways in order to escape maybe some of the restrictions and pernicious effects of all this. For example, let me go back. Some of the first challenges in the early part of the 20th century, for example, were people trying to become naturalized citizens of the United States. And for the most part, many of them had to claim whiteness in order to do that. The famous, there's a couple of famous ones. One is the Thin case, Thind, in 1923, I believe, and around the same time, the Ozawa case, Ozawa, which was a Japanese man in Berkeley, actually. That was, but I'm going to do the Thin case because here we had a Sikh man, South Asian, who wanted to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. He claimed that in prevailing anthropological wisdom of the time, that South Asians were Caucasians. Goes to court, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the Thin decision, in 2023, says that we agree that Asian Indians are in fact Caucasians, but they're not white by what a common person on the street thinks a white person is. So it's a great Supreme Court decision. You could be Caucasian, but you're not white. And you have to be white to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. Thin does not become a citizen, but not only that, there was a group of of Asian Indian folks in the country who through some means had gotten naturalization, who were then denaturalized as a result of the Thin decision. And one, a community leader, commits suicide after that. So the point being here is that, making claims to whiteness has a certain degree of, people were sort of, people's faces automatically appear out of the blue. The other one I want to say is that why Mexicans became a racial group and category only in 1930 has a lot to do with this kinds of claims to whiteness as well, of not wanting to be racialized as different. And that's why we had the Mexican Americans as well as the Mexican government directly intervening into trying to get that category removed for the 1940 census. And it's a kind of troubled history. Many of you may be familiar with, there's a case, what is it, the Westminster case? Early on, this was prior to the Brown decision, in which a Latinx family, a Mexican-American family, was challenging their daughters not being able to get into this school. And it was based pretty much on Spanish language, and that when, in fact, I'm trying to remember the case. Was it Hernandez? I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on this. Oh, you might know. Do you know?
Mendez?
It's the Mendez case. Thank you. Mendez versus Westminster, right? And there's different accounts of this, but you should read the critical accounts, because there were attempts by the NAACP and the Japanese American Citizens League to make this a racial case. And Mendez and the attorneys for Mendez did not want to go there to say that why their daughters were being excluded because it was based on race. So I'm sorry, it's kind of a long way to get to your question, Efren, about, you know, all I'm saying is that people have aspired to be in different categories in order to sort of, as I say, escape the kind of oppressive circumstances in which they find themselves. And it leads to very kind of weird strategic responses too. Think about the whole concept of passing, huh? To be able to pass as another group. Or the ways in which many of us may code switch in everyday life and settings, you know? It's all reflective of the ways in which these categories have enormous weight and power in shaping our lives, and that we have to somehow strategically respond to them.
Thank you for elaborating on that.
Yeah, sure.
I have a quick question. I was noticing, and if you can speak to this more, it's in the same vein of the Iranian American questions. I saw in 2020 that's again part of the Middle East find its way back into the white category, Lebanese, Syrian.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
yeah, and that's in the backdrop of 2011, you know, the Arab Spring and all this. I'm from that region, so I'm very familiar with the conversation. Maybe Dalia too, but there is a big conversation about who actually the Arabs. You know, if the Arab associated with Middle East and associated therefore with white, we all know that majority of Arabs lives in Africa. In reality, is not in the Middle East, and it seems this kind of basic knowledge of it, and even many of us in the African continent, we claim that actually Arab migrated from Africa rather than the other way around, migrated from Africa to the Middle
right.
East. So the question being, you don't see the Palestinian, for example, but yet again allow this kind of like as if all Lebanese are white, or all Syrian are white, or all Jordanian are white. So if you, like why, what do you think, why this race again, national origin groups make their way again back?
Yeah, but I mean, that's a great question. But what it speaks to, Al-Sadiq, is also the way in which some of the original definitions as defined back in 1977 and revised in 1997 are very much incomplete. You know, I mean, not incomplete, but they're founded on some notion of original peoples inhabiting a particular geographic area, where because of migration and flows and everything, the concept of how race travels, for example, is not really accounted for, you know? And it gets really confusing. I once met a theoretical physicist who's a third or fourth generation South African. He's white, okay? But he tells me he's African American because his family has grown up for 4 generations in South Africa, you know? So like he's conflating like that national origins and his almost like an ethnicity argument with the race one, you know? So, and this happens for all groups too. A great study is, there was a study of looking at Dominicans in New York, and the ways in which people have to relearn racial categories in a new national setting as to who they are. But not only that, what was interesting about this a particular work, which was comparative, it was also looking at Puerto Ricans. But among it also means that people not only send like economic money remittances back home, but they also send back ideas about what race is. And shows how that over time, what's interesting is that people from the DR on the East Coast start learning about what it means to be, you know, I mean, certain degrees around claiming Blackness or being Black, and that they send those ideas back home, and people in the Dominican Republic start reshaping their ideas about what race is. So it's like, it's almost like race travels and it's a two-way street. And people sort of rethink about these kinds of categories. Think about, for example, on the 2020 census, it's going to allow a much more detailed breakdown of who's Black in the United States. You know, and we're seeing that just demographically, you know, I've seen this in the Bay Area, you know, or like, well, I mean, it's interesting because like in Minnesota, for example, there's huge Somali and Ethiopian groups. I don't see groups getting talked about so much in this kind of context, but tremendous amount of new African immigrants in the country as well. And we don't know that much about, you know, those groups because just get coded as Black. So the 2020 census should give us a new, at least much more specific data by which to look at these things. I'm sorry, I got away from your question, but the question being is that, yeah, it doesn't account well for people who travel across to different regions and how they're going to be regarded racially, you know. But it's the same thing, you know, I mean, folks of color, well, I mean, maybe not some, but, you know, being Asian, it's really amazing to go, you know, to Europe or some other place, or I go to down South America or something. People can't believe when you say, well, I'm American. They just can't believe you're American because that, well, you're not white. A white person is American, you know. And in fact, that's a kind of language which has been always disturbing to me. And like when I talk to, you know, my extended family, because they always describe white people as Americans. It's like, no, you know, who is that person? Oh, that was this American guy, you know. Well, thinking like, hey, aren't we Americans? You know. There's ways in which that kind of identity is a way to sort of self-marginalize ourselves. You know?
I appreciate that. I think you're absolutely right. You know, for the time I lived here, even with people from the same region, especially from the African continent, the way in which we engage with race in the United States give us a glimpse into our own selves, to reflect and to define our own, you know, race as well. Because, you know, coming from a dominant group in Sudan, for example, I never thought about race for the others, not for me, because I'm the dominant group. But when you come here and you get confronted with the idea that actually that's not true, you are part of a non-dominant group. So you start to rethink about race. And that's, like you said, you know, I have many conversations with my extended family, whether that Black, you know, because it's still, believe it or not, some people in that part of sub-Saharan Africa, and they look just like me, and they don't think of themselves as Black. And it's very interesting because of the colonial heritage and how that extended. And it really destabilized the idea of race and ethnicity. Maybe in many countries, we focus on ethnicity more than race, as in the United States. But it's very interesting. The census conversation is really informative in the sense that you get to term with how you would like to identify how people perceive you.
Yeah, that's quite right. I just want to make one addendum to that, which is interesting, is also the ways in which there's a professor in African American studies, Stephen Small, who actually, he told me once he's actually a Euro-American because he's actually from Britain, but he's mixed race. His father was West Indian Black. His mother was white. He grew up in Liverpool. He talks like the Beatles. He's got this great lecture where how he's read in the world varies so much, you know, because he's a racially mixed person. He says when he's in Germany, he's read this way. When he's in Algeria, he's seen as another group, you know. It's just like he does this whole thing where in the world I am reshapes how people greet me. In Greece, they start talking to him in a different, you know, language. You know, it's just really hilarious. But it shows you that kind of fluidity of race, but also, I mean, for some folks, not having a clearly defined kind of ways in which you can be placed in a convenient racial category means that people will treat you very, very differently.
Michael, everything that you have been talking so far resonates with me a lot. I have been also read like with many different lenses. I live in South Africa, in Germany, and in New Zealand. I went to school there, I worked, and so I had all different ones. I never came to the US until recently. And so in South Africa, I was labeled as white. And when I told somebody in the US, like about me being white in South Africa, that person said, like, told me literally, I never hear or saw anybody like you calling herself white. And I was like, what does anybody like you means? And then when I came to the US, it clicked me that it was like, oh, anybody like me, like Hispanic. And then, yeah, many stories around that. But I have a question. In the piece that we read, you talk about how you try to stay away from these two opposite ends of understanding race. One is like completely fixed, and the other one is let's deny that there is race.
Yeah.
And I want to know, what if you go to one specific place to try to understand how race is socially, because now we have been talking about how race is socially constructed in the US. You talk about the one drop rule, which doesn't operate in Latin America. There is no thing as such as passing in Latin America. And it's actually the opposite. If you have like a little bit of European ancestors, then you are mestizo, which is a widening category or widening project, right? And so what I want to know is, in other contexts outside of the US, when you try to understand the process of racial formation, is there the same steps that you should follow to, if you want to write a book like yours, for example, that is absolutely based on in the US, but in another context? Is it the same things that you have to observe? Is it the same patterns, dynamics that you have to observe, or are all of those also have to be contextualized? And I'm asking because I try to understand how race operates in Chile, because there isn't scholarly work on Chile about this, and so I'm trying to develop a list of questions and a list of signs that I need to be looking throughout society to understand how race operates there.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. That, you know, it's why it's racial formation in the United States is because it's harder to think about the rest of the world, you know, or to say this is how race operates globally. And you're quite right in understanding too. Is there a kind of framework of things to be attentive to in order to understand how race gets constructed in very different social settings? I think it's all pretty contextual in a lot of ways. Well, and I say that and then draw back from that, in that we do have a much more sort of globalized notions about race as well. And this first from the very beginnings, you know, from the period, the age of quote unquote discovery, or the ways in which people have thought about concepts of race. But in every setting, it's very contextually much more specific. I mean, you're quite right. The kind of one drop rule was a very sharp boundary here in the United States. It's not true for a lot of Central and South America, for example. And the notion of you know, mestizo consciousness, mestizaje, you know, I mean, there's ways in which the kind of hybridity is appreciated in ways that it's not in the United States too. The, you know, the kind of mixture of kind of indigenous Spanish as well as Afro-Caribbean stuff that takes place is much more, sorry, I'm trying to find the word, much more sort of open, a lot more different. Someone was showing me this thing. What was it called? La Raza Cosmica. It's
Cosmica?
something, yeah, La Raza
Mhm.
Cosmica. Are you familiar with that? About
Yes,
the
absolutely. Jose Vasconcelos from Mexico quote that term to say that, to talk about the superiority of the mestizo.
Yeah, just so you know, that's a kind of racial project. It's ways in which race is being thought about. But even in each of these countries, you know, think about the ways in which about Mexico. You know, you have subordinated indigenous populations within Mexico. Now that you have very significant Afro-Mexican populations, say in Guerrero or in Veracruz on the Gulf Coast side. Race is very, it's got a lot of stuff going on, even in this context. I have to share with you, I was working with a graduate student in sociology who had this project looking at undocumented Mexican workers in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She did a different dissertation, by the way, on this than this was, but her original thing was to look at Afro-Mexicans who are coming into this region, wondering if Afro-Mexicans were going to try to pass as blacks in the U.S. blacks in order to escape ICE surveillance, and it turned out it didn't work out that well, mainly because, linguistic stuff, they just couldn't blend in. But this notion somehow that, I'm going to pass myself off as a U.S. black in order so that my undocumented status isn't seen as quite visible and evident. I mean, it's kind of interesting kinds of ways in which these racialized groups are then embedded in a very new kind of situation, which has them trying to assume or take on new identities. So the answer to your question is, it's specific. It's sort of context, and in many ways, some of the claims we make in racial formation for the United States, I don't think translate as well to other countries, in the world. I'm going to say, it made me think of two things, and one's kind of unrelated, but it's related to the census, is that there's a number of countries, of course, that don't have censuses. France doesn't has a census, doesn't track by race. And it's a good example of saying, just because you don't ask about race and in a colorblind fashion doesn't mean you don't have racial problems. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what's been very interesting in the French cases, there's a number of French social activists of color who have been trying to do their own censuses because they lack data in specific cities and locales of, who the population is, who the community is in many respects. It's a good example to refute charges of that. But to get back to your question more generally too, we make this claim in the chapter which you read that race is a kind of significant template of social division and organization in the United States. I don't know if that's true in quite in other places in the way it is in the United States. Because I think what we were trying to say is not to say that race was not complexly connected and in kinds of intersection with notions about class, sexuality, gender, etc. But that in the United States, the original sins of both the genocide and expropriation of indigenous peoples on these shores and racially based slavery had a profound effect of what is class in the United States. Many of the early kinds of laws preventing miscegenation, relations between blacks and whites in the colonies, are really directed against white women. And so a lot of things, gender, sexuality, class, that we're trying to argue that race has had this profound effect on shaping a lot of those axes of stratification and difference in the United States. That may be peculiar to the United States, but it's kind of an important one. It's kind of ways in which why race has become such a important organizing principle of not only of dividing society, but also race becomes an important axes around mobilization. Think about the ways in which the civil rights movement and the strategies and tactics employed by the civil rights movement had profound effects on the second wave of feminism, the anti-war movement, anti-nuclear movements, and class-based movements as well.
I will say that it is a huge template in Latin America too. Like we do have, I think it's crucial to understand Latin American societies too. It's just that like the way they work might be different. Like of course maybe we don't have an actual law saying that blacks and whites cannot, you know, like get together and have kids. Maybe that's not a law properly, but like all this cosmic race thing is a thing, you know, like my father is black and my mom was like her aunt told my mom that thank God I wasn't that black. You know, that was the thing that she said when she saw me the first time. So like, it's, you know, like these little things that are still there, but we don't really want to like recognize and put that in the center of our discussions.
Yeah.
So of course, class is very important. But if you really get to see, for example, in Colombia, those who are like more affected by conflict are the Black and indigenous communities.
Yeah.
So like, but we try to say no, it's like we all are, right? That I want to say that, but also like how Latino is like a very, like it's a more homogenization of nationalities and races. And so, you know, I became Latina once I came here. I wouldn't go by my country saying, hi, I'm Latina, you know, like that's not a thing. It's just like while I'm here, and for me, it's very weird because, you know, I mean, there is also, as there are like, you know, an imagination, like imagining nationhood, there is also a Latin American imagination, also like historically constructed imagination of Latin America as all America, like this big continent. But then, you know, maybe the Caribbean is different, you know, than maybe La Sierra back in Peru, or, you know, like, and even inside the countries, you know, where, like when you go to the frontiers, the borders, maybe between Peru and Chile, is not the same as people that are more in the south. Or if you go to the coast in Colombia, or the llanos in that we like share a huge border with Venezuela, that whole border is like, it's like a completely different culture, right? So like this homogenization of Latina, for me, like the census and those questions have always been very difficult, you know. And Colombian is, it's not like, for me, it's very, very strange, you know, like to say, and even to define myself as Colombian, because sometimes I can, you know, feel more identified with people that are from here or from other places. So there are a lot of Colombians that I don't like, you know, and I feel that are completely different than me, and than like the way I think and my culture, like, you know, the city and the rural areas are completely different. So I think it's something that we should be thinking about. In Colombia, since 1991, we declare in the Constitution that we are a plurinational and multi-ethnic society. That's in the Constitution right now. Before that, like there were no Black people or indigenous people, you know. So from now, we do recognize that, and our census is like, if you're Black, but you are palenquero, that are like the descendants of Maroon communities. That's one a kind of Black person. Or if you are from the islands, that is San Andres, that had like more of a let's say English culture, you know, like it's more Caribbean. Or if you are from, so like those classifications, I think are very, yeah, those state mandated, like, you know, like they have such a big weight also in opportunities in many ways. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling and saying a lot of stuff, but it's just
No, there's a lot there. I mean, let me comment on a couple of things, two things, really. One is, yes, you're quite right about that. I mean, in this hemisphere, and we could debate globally, the ideology of anti-Blackness is pretty profound. You know, it really does shape a lot. Think about too how this even works out in terms of colorism. You know, and it's probably true in Latin America too. I mean, the notion of being, in terms like, you know, Blanca versus the Morena, or, you know, I mean, the gradations of in which two siblings could be of the same biological set of parents, but have very different skin tones. And that would put them in very different kinds of racialized categories, and the kind of ways in which whiteness, lightness is sort of, is valorized, you know? The other part that I want to say is about pan-ethnicity. All these pan-ethnic groups are a relatively new construction. And I'll say this, for example, it's quite clear that most Asians in the United States don't think of themselves as Asian Americans. They think of themselves as being Korean Americans or Japanese Americans, or well, actually Japanese Americans, or, you know, Vietnamese Americans, or not only that. I mean, I was down in working with some community groups in Oakland, and I didn't realize there was a significant Burmese population, you know, and there is here. But not only that, a woman comes up to me and says, well, you know, Burmese is even a kind of too much of an umbrella term for her, because she said there are six ethnic groups in Burma, and that I got to be more specific about how to think about these things. And it's very true. I mean, so think about what an assemblage of quote unquote race, nationalities, and everything gets assumed under the term like Hispanic or Latinx, you know? I mean, and it's important to know when that's interesting. I mean, when it's important to think about groups in the aggregate, and when it's much better to think about data, for example, as being disaggregated, you know? Do we want to know the difference between the way in which Hmong Americans have their educational attainment versus somebody who's Japanese American? For example, those differences, you know, make a real difference. And even within countries, the kind of ethnic regional variations. I once met this Filipina American, and she said she didn't even think of herself as being Filipino until she came to the United States. Because in the Philippines, region and language played much more of a distinctive role in forging her identity. She saw the Philippines itself as, you know, not a cohesive identity. But she said, here in the United States, I became Filipina. I tell people that. That's always this kind of tension and dynamic between kind of much more specificity and the use of these kinds of broad categories. You know? Yeah.
I'm curious with that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say we're almost at 2:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, especially if you have to jump off to get to another meeting.
No, thankfully I don't immediately, but boy, I've been zoomed out for the last couple of weeks for sure.
I think I interrupted someone. I didn't see though who else was speaking. Maybe we can take one more question.
Okay.
It was me. I also don't want to take up time if one of the fellows have a question or something. So I'll give it up to you all.
I said Brianna. I'll just say if anyone has to leave, because I know it's almost 2:30, please feel free to jump off the line. But please go ahead, Brianna.
I just have like a short, it's like very short thought. Like how you said, the Filipina didn't become Filipino until she came to the US. So my parents are Mexican, I was born here. And I feel like that I didn't become like white or white passing until I got to college, because I grew up in a very like largely Hispanic community. So I guess like just want to say like I kind of feel the same thing, but it's different because it's not like going from one country to another. It's just pretty much going from high school to college. So I just wanted to say that.
Mm-hmm. I just want to mention one thing about this. I years ago, there was a graduate student I knew who is Cuban American who grew up in LA a long time ago. And this was from a long time ago too. And never quite knew that she was Cuban, because she grew up in a predominantly Mexican American community, and there were no other Cuban families around. So that became her turn of identity. And it was only much later in college that she came to appreciate that, hey, we weren't Mexican, we were doing something else. But really quickly, Nilo, did you have a question? Oh, I don't want to cut you off. Did you have?
Well, sorry, I'll just ask. I was just curious in terms of filling out the census, you know, in the context of everything that we've been talking about. You mentioned at some point that like folks of Latinx backgrounds have a hard time filling it out, and then that's also recognized that way, I guess, when the census forms are read. And so I'm curious with that. I'm also of Iranian background, and so now they're doing a campaign of saying, you know, before the last campaign was "Check it white, you ain't right." Now it's you know, fill out whichever racial category that you feel like you identify with, but then also fill in Iranian in the added
on some of the race box,
right, or any box.
Any of their boxes.
They're not even saying like specifying specifically.
Okay.
Which kind of opens it up a little bit more and broadens the definition within our community. But then there's, you know, a lot of us also don't identify as white. And so I'm wondering if people are putting in, say if you're putting in some other race and then writing in Iranian, is that then going to be accepted in that way, or will they, you know, because there are also Iranians that are Black, for example, and so are they going to be pushed into the white category because that's where folks of MENA backgrounds are currently classified, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. They will be coded. They may not be. So there may be several ways in which Iranians could get coded. So if you wrote some of the race and wrote Iranian, they will code you. They would utilize that Iranian code and have some, you know, you'd be able to find data based on that. Now, the other one, say you check off that you're white. Now, for the first time, there's an open box that says, well, what kind of white person are you? And you would be able to write probably Iranian there too, if you wanted to, or Black or whatever, you know, in some of the other racial groups. I mean, so yes. So in other words, they would be able to code that up. I should tell you that the Census Bureau has a book. You could download it. There are over 900 ethnic groups listed in it. You know, almost 1,000. So they have these kind of groups you've never heard of before, because if somebody writes that in, they know how to code it. So that's pretty impressive in many respects to be able to do that. So in other words, the data is not going to be dismissed, is what I'm saying. It will be somewhere. But for those Iranians who used to check white, and you know, they have the option now of under white being able to write something in, as well as do some of the race part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was curious also, you know, how it works on the back end. Then is the data going to be dismissed? But it sounds like then it's not. But they actually
will do that. They will do that. You know. Yeah. Lindsay, did you have something?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask a follow-up question, because I'm wondering then what that means as, like, that's a very kind of bottom-up approach, is like people are identifying themselves this way on the census, and then now we're just categorizing it. But I'm kind of wondering what that looks like as far as the actual allocation of resources. Are they going to be able to consolidate those together on the back end? And also just what that means for consolidation of power in general, because I mean, we see like really early policies for like the FHA talking about housing policies and redlining, and it's like we're still specifying Italians and Jews, but then eventually we'll allow you to like consolidate under whiteness and have different access.
Right.
What does that look like for like
Yeah, you know, for a lot of the data is that everything they get has to be coded back up at some point to those major food group categories.
Right.
So despite what you may specify under the white thing, what's going to be important for most programs is that you're white, that you're black, that you're Asian.
Mm-hmm.
And so most agencies or even the states need to provide what are called the minimum racial and ethnic data to the federal government. So it'll just be coded up, really. You know, I didn't get into, I don't know if I mentioned this in the article too, but Asians and Pacific Islanders used to be one group, and they were split in for Census 2000. And what's interesting about that split is it created this Pacific Islander group that's about 0.1% of the US population. But every state has to provide that as a minimum of what the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population in their state looks like. In Wyoming, or like institutions have to report that as well. So it's kind of an interesting political process where we got a new category that's such a small sliver, really small sliver of the US population. And that's yet another political story and battle. But yeah, if you worry about how's that all going to get coded up, it will just get coded up by, you know, what was sad is people have done that, just real briefly, people have done the ethnicity thing. I didn't show you another chart. I don't even know if I have this. If you ask people to talk about, particularly whites, about their ethnic ancestry, they give you a really mixed response. You know, there's a great study by sociologist Mary Waters called Ethnic Options. I think she studied whites in Philadelphia and San Jose. You could ask brothers and sisters what their ethnic identity is, and you're going to get two different answers, you know? Or if someone says, well, I think our grandmother's part Italian, wasn't she? She says, that's right, she was part Italian. And so what it's interesting is that when whites are asked this question a lot in the United States, they give you a lot of false answers about particularly those who are like, you know, oh, I guess we're German, Dutch, and part, you know, people don't know, actually. And people are also susceptible to the items that you list. So in this other questionnaire, when they've asked people, what's the funny one? It's like French or something. In one case, French was listed as an example. You know, you're white, and then what are you? If you take out the example of French, in this one survey they did, 20% of the French population in the United States drop out. It's like people got to see the examples, and then they say, that's right. You know, our grandmother was part of that. So there's the other part of it is it's all self-identity. So, you know, these categories themselves, as I said, have a lot of confusing and contradictory elements to them. Yeah. Yes, down here, Eliza.
Hi. One thing I was curious about, this is a slightly different direction, but in your chapter you mentioned the conceptual deflation of racism.
Yeah.
And you talked about how racist acts are seen as crimes of passion. I was curious about that because I'm not a lawyer yet, but I noticed that crimes of passion are prosecuted as like lesser than other crimes. So I was wondering if you could like elaborate on that.
Oh, that probably was a wrong turn of phrase to say crime of passion, but you're quite right. You know, it's seen as kind of it could be seen as a legitimating, you know, or a variable to take into account. Let me say what I think we were talking about there, which is that we seem to be drawn to outrageous acts. Think, George Floyd or something like that as that's racism.
Mm-hmm.
Without thinking about, that's the conceptual deflation. Or somebody uses the N-word, or someone does, a celebrity or something. That's always drawn the kind of wrath as oh man, that's what racism is. But the sort of normal racism that we encounter every day, the kind of, from microaggressions to institutional forms of inequality, often go undetected or unnoticed, So the point being is that, and that's what's missing in this account too. It's not only, we're not talking about the police, we're not talking about Floyd Jordan and the Minnesota Police Department. We're talking about a whole range of ways in which the Black population in the Twin Cities has just incurred all this, structural, systemic racism, right? But it's really difficult, is what I think we're trying to say there, to get us to think out of the box not think about racism as just being, the famous guy on, famous sports figure said the N-word or something like that, That's what I meant. But you're right about the crime of passion thing. In other words, these are often seen as, people could point to these things and say, they're individual, they're abnormal. They're now 3 men who chased the black jogger down, led to his death, they're just exceptional folks or something. No, the point is that it detracts from looking at racism as these kinds of individual acts of passion to something much more systemic and normalized. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was thinking about that in that direction too, especially like in this era of Trump. I think a lot of us are looking at, I guess, like forms of individual racism and might be ignoring like systemic racism. So I liked what you did there, for lack of a better phrase.
What's interesting too, this sort of pointed out to me that many of if you read some of these corporations and everything who are coming out with their, statement about, the horror of George Floyd's murder and others, they talk a lot, they've adopted a lot more language around systemic structural stuff than they have in the past. It's an interesting turn, I think. I'm not sure what it means. I'd like to think it's because groups like Other and Belonging are having an inordinate influence on stuff. I don't think so. But there is a definite turn in the way in which they describe the problem, I think. I should pay attention to that. Yeah. Okay. We good? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Hi. Sorry for taking up so much time. I found what I found really interesting about the census was the phrasing around like, the origins of original peoples.
Oh yeah.
And especially, how we see that phrase community attachment come and go. Because what it reminded me of was like, especially Mary Waters' idea of like symbolic ethnicity.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask about what you thought about how the census uses this idea of origin, but then in public life, we see, and also in institutions, we see like white Americans kind of adopt like nativism, like they adopt native imagery to kind of, further the settler colonial project. And a lot of native communities like dislike when their histories are posited as, when they settled like 15,000 years ago, and to kind of like decenter them from the narrative that they want. And so, yeah, sorry, it's a long question, but how do you think that, those two are in tension? And do you think that this kind of fragmentation around the idea of origins across different scales of time makes belonging difficult, or senses of rootedness difficult.
Yeah, it does. And it kind of speaks back to Al-Sadiq's question too about, how migration and travel render some of those things kind of distinct and problematic. I mean, I think the definitions as they're construed around original peoples, it is really a problem that are inhabiting a particular geographic zone, because it assumes that that's always been clear. I mean, we did all come out of Africa, and migrate out of that. So to say, well, these were the original peoples here, what does that mean, Because all of the original peoples were from Africa. That's clear by the evidence, Question is how they get everywhere else in the world. I mean, what did that mean? So yes, that to begin with, they were working with a kind of a faulty concept of that, But they were trying for some precision and definition. And I actually think probably those definitions are going to be revisited again, given the kind of fluidity around it. In other words, I don't think the categories will change, but the explanations for them will. And, the census has this thing where it says, or the Office of Management and Budget too, that these are not meant to be biological categories. They're really clear that they don't want to be seen as embracing biological genetic definitions of who these groups are. But in fact, they also assume that there are these kinds of original inhabitants of particular geographic zones, which is probably not right either. I didn't get into this. Al-Sadiq knows at times I've talked to about, and it's in the chapter about race and genetics, which is interesting because there's a lot going on through ethnic ancestry, through, in drug manufacturing and a whole series of stuff. Or, think about all the, 23andMe and stuff, trying to figure out with greater and greater precision, I gotta say, they're trying to locate where folks are from. And a lot of that is sort of, continentally based. And a lot of it is, you can't root it in countries. What does it mean to be 100% Costa Rican? Who is 100% Costa Rican? Or what does it mean to be partially Costa Rican? And, when did Costa Rica come into existence? There's all these kinds of troubling aspects of the way in which some of that is read. But I guess the point being is, yeah, you're right. I think there's a real problem with the language, the very language of the definition of the categories. Okay. All right.
Right. Well, I imagine we could continue this conversation for much longer. So if you have any follow-up questions, I will say please reach out to Michael. And your email address is, I think it's on our website, but we can share it with you.
Right. Yeah, please do. Happy to. So thanks, Nicole.
Yes,
oh, thanks for sending that message. Let me know when you need to go. I was looking at our chat now. So. But thank you all. And
thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Is this the second week of the program or?
We started on 19th. Yeah, today is the second. This is the second week, third week. Yeah. I'm sorry. It's been a Holocaust. Yeah.
Okay. All
yeah.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Best of luck, folks. See you. Thank you.
Thank you.